Welcome to this special episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. In today's episode, I'm joined by Bachelor of Science and Arts student Scarlett Wakelin, who has participated in the Menzies Early Career Network. This network has brought together university students from across Australia to engage with the history of the Menzies era, connect with like-minded peers and some of the leading Australian political historians. As part of their involvement in the program, the 2024 participants contributed to a really special project, writing chapters for our upcoming book, Finding Menzies, A New Generation's Inspiration for Foreign Affairs, Social Policy and Political Thought. So in today's episode, I'm going to be asking Scarlett about her chapter, Remembering and Acknowledging the Anglo-Australian Relationship of the 20th Century. Scarlett, what attracted you to this topic?
I really liked this topic because the nuclear ambitions of Menzies blends politics, defence, and industry, which are great topics to talk about. And I'm also a part of the Australian Institute of Nuclear Science and Engineering Women in Science and Mentorship Program.
Fantastic.
So I had kind of an eye to nuclear science. I was really interested in it. The program actually took us to Ansto and we got a tour around of it. It was really nice.
Oh, that's great. Well, tell me about Australia's, I guess, nuclear ambitions. I feel like this is little known. People just assume Australia doesn't have nuclear weapons. We must never have wanted them. But of course, we were quite involved in the development of nuclear weapons in the 1940s.
Yeah, we definitely were. So it kind of started with the Chifley government, which is a Labor government. They set up capabilities for uranium mining and an interest in kind of nuclear science. And then the Menzies government kind of advanced this with more of a interest in nuclear weapons. So Menzies' great aim was to have weapons as well as a nuclear capability that we could use for engineering, medical imaging, and so on.
Yeah, and so Chifley's authorising in the 1940s uranium exploration, which of course is essential. Uranium being an essential um, input into nuclear weapons and nuclear power, and setting up that Woomera rocket range. I mean, these were heady times, obviously in the middle of World War II, and then subsequent to that, and of course the US had developed their own nuclear weapons and had used them on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Can you tell me about Australia's how it worked so closely with Britain through this process? Because well, obviously wasn't doing this by itself.
Yeah, so Australia really relied on Britain. They couldn't have done any nuclear science without them. And we talk about why did they choose Britain over America? That's a kind of question. Well, it's because up until 1949, all Australians were British citizens and we're part of the Commonwealth, we're part of the Empire. We already had a very strong connection with them. And America took this very kind of isolationist view when it comes to nuclear weapons. You know, they didn't want to spread their plans. They were the only people that wanted to have them. They didn't want to make it a worldwide thing. So it's pretty obvious why we went with the British.
Yeah, and so what were we doing with the British then through this development? I mean, we weren't developing nuclear weapons in the end for our own use. It was part of a broader program, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think the goal of Menzies, although was to develop an Australian capability, I think the idea was to use Britain and learn a lot from them, establish that relationship, and then make Australia its own nuclear power as well.
Yeah. And how did Australia then go about trying to acquire nuclear weapons? Can you tell me about that?
Like the long range missile program.
Yeah.
Well, there were a lot of things they did. So, Prime Minister Chifley, he organised Mount Painter in South Australia to be kind of the home of atomic science. And then since then, South Australia has just grown in that regard. So at Woomera, the United Kingdom, Australia, invested in the long range weapons program. And that was just kind of for anti tank weapons. And this was in the late 40s. So it's still kind of like from post-war.
Yeah.
And then from then they created Ansto, which is in Lucas Heights.
Mm. And of course, I mean, we still have a nuclear reactor at Lucas Heights to this day, don't we? And there's wonderful photographs of Menzies opening Lucas Heights in the 1950s and making jokes apparently about what happens if I press this button. I think making all the scientists very nervous. What about I guess building the workforce to work on these nuclear programs? I mean, this was a real challenge to our education system, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, it was all about kind of redesigning the education system as well, um, to fill that hole of nuclear science, because we still deal with this problem today of nuclear engineering is a postgraduate subject. You don't really do it at undergraduate level, even though there's a lot of scientists want to. There's a lot of engineers that I meet that do like mechatronics, but really they just want to be doing nuclear. So yeah, and I think in England you can do it more at an undergraduate level. It's
Yeah.
about filling the space and filling up the workforce from an education perspective.
So where did the nuclear science sorry, where did the nuclear science study sort of develop? Was it largely focused at the Australian National University?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, so nuclear fission was discovered in Germany in 1939, and that was like the catalyst for everything. That started everything. And yeah, then ANU had all the capabilities.
Oh, great. Yeah, yeah. And the UK is supporting Australia in the development of our teaching and research of nuclear science, isn't it? It donates a particle accelerator to the ANU, which
Yeah,
obviously helped the development of the research capabilities at that university. Yeah.
yeah,
Um,
that was yeah.
what about the reasons why Australia allowed the British to conduct nuclear tests on its soil? Because it's interesting, Canada doesn't allow the British, even though it's part of the Empire and the Commonwealth, to conduct those tests, but Australia does. Was it? I mean, did Canada know something that we didn't, or?
Yeah, well, with any nuclear test, there's a lot of health risks, environmental risks. And I think possibly Australia was seen as this very vast place that, the majority of people lived on the coast. I'm not too sure about Canada's geography, but I know it to be a very cold place and the weather to be quite harsh. And Australia was just kind of hot, but that was about it.
Yeah.
But I think to go back to Menzies aims, because we're in Australia, so we have this tyranny of distance. We're so far away from England and Europe that we have a much stronger push to bring things here and to set up R&D here. And the only way we could do that was through, the UK, whereas I think Canada probably relies a bit more on the US, and that because throughout this whole story, they were relying on the US a lot as well. So they
Yeah.
probably feel a bit more safe to do their own exploration, whereas we really needed to bring it to our country.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Tell me about the nuclear tests that were conducted on Australian soil. I mean, you talked about Woomera, but there were other ones as well, weren't there?
Yeah, the Maralinga tests
Yeah,
are the big ones, like the ones everyone knows, and at Nullarbor. And yeah, the main research around that area it was more that we could do the tests, not that they were totally amazing, but that they worked. And that was the achievement. And then obviously another consequence of that was the impact it had on Aboriginal communities at, like they call it, like the Fright of Nullarbor or something. And
yeah, yeah. So what are those long-term legacies of the nuclear tests and the program? I mean, there's some very tragic ones, aren't there?
yeah, I think the one that I talked about a bit in the paper was just that, like, the Menzies government attempted to tell the people living in that area that they would be doing testing. Yet it was hard to find these tribes because it was at a time like you don't have GPS, you didn't know they were there. And I think it was really difficult, but there was a bit of a lack of a concern for their safety. and obviously the cancer risk and stuff. But the British government did pay $20 million to clean up, or pounds, sorry, to clean up the site afterwards. But that was after, not before. So.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, and some of those the nuclear materials, the radiation takes millions of years to dissipate. So whatever cleanup you can do, it's not going to return the land to it what it was. And there were some Indigenous people who had long-term health consequences as a result of these tests, weren't there?
Yeah.
Yeah. The importance of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, it ends up sort of waning. I mean, we obviously developed the Lucas Heights reactor, and we have ANSTO being created, but we give up our sort of aspiration for nuclear weapons. Do you know why that is, Scarlett?
I think we have a nuclear capability because when we set up ANSTO, we set up all the regulations of how to run nuclear power. The only issue is that the zeitgeist and the politics at the moment doesn't allow for that. But it's a worldwide, anti-nuclear weapons. And there's very difference in, say, you want nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, and why we don't have them is just, it's not the zeitgeist, I would
Right.
say. Because Menzies did this a bit because he had to, in the sense of, it was coming into the Cold War, the very early stressful period of the Cold War. Everyone was talking about nuclear weapons. And you had all the communist expansion in Southeast Asia. And he was very worried that Australia needed to defend itself. And that, I don't think Australia has that impact right now.
No. Yeah. And in terms of nuclear energy, I mean that the aspiration to have a civil nuclear industry was really dumped by John Gorton in the 1970s. I mean, as a young person, uni student, what do you feel like the legacy of that decision is when you look at many countries and sort of our counterpart OECD countries have nuclear power, but Australia doesn't, despite having, I think, a third of the world's uranium reserves here. So, it's a very curious situation we find ourselves in.
Yeah, well, I study earth science at university. And I guess people are quick to say that, oh, people who are in the earth sciences may vilify coal and are very pro renewable energy. But that's really not the case when you sit in these geology lectures. They're actually pro coal and they just don't really rely. They don't believe that renewable energy is the answer because of the recycling. It takes a lot to mine these rare earth elements, and then that creates a lot of energy. It requires a lot of energy and creates a lot of output, and then you can't recycle them. So even people in the earth sciences don't fully trust renewable energy as a viable solution. So I'd be more inclined to go nuclear, but I'm not an economist, so
Yeah, well, there's the
yeah.
economics, of course, and I mean that in the end was part of the reason why we didn't develop the civil nuclear industries. We had such abundant supplies of coal. The economics didn't work out. I mean, if we had just had uranium and not coal, then nuclear energy would have seemed a pretty straightforward decision. But with such abundant supplies of coal and with cheap energy, why would you invest billions and billions of dollars? Well, back then probably millions and millions in developing nuclear energy, which could be met. Those needs could have been met by the coal-powered fire stations.
And it's an interesting point that the output of these nuclear reactors create materials that are necessary for nuclear weapons. So it's a whole cycle. So potentially, maybe, obviously, the argument is you can't have nuclear power without weapons. Like it's just something that'll flow on from each other. Like the nuclear submarines, one day you'll add a warhead to them. They're not just powered by nuclear, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, a fascinating chapter you've written for our new book, Scarlett, and thank you so much for being part of the Menzies Early Career Network.
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. I really enjoyed it.